Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over our third video for the upcoming graphic novel Bobby Fischer, The Knight Who Killed the Kings. Now if you do want more information about the upcoming graphic novel, we will have a link below in the video description. Now in this particular video, we're going to be going over the 1966 U.S. Championship, and this is actually Bobby Fischer's last U.S. Championship that he ever played. Now he did end up winning 8 years in a row. Up to this given time, he was the 7-time champion, so pretty much everyone that he played knew that they were playing the 7-time champion, which I think in this particular game played a huge role, as his opponents, we'll see later on, actually had an advantage and could have won the game, but miscalculated and actually ended up losing the game to Bobby Fischer. During this particular game, Bobby Fischer was 23 years old. His opponent is 38-year-old Paul Benko. Paul Benko, as many people know out there, is the founder of the Benko Gambit, one of the most popular openings, and also the Benko opening, which he actually used in this game. Now, that opening starts out with G3. So definitely a great match. We do have the 7-time reigning champion versus one of the most winning players in the U.S. Open Chess Championship, and that's Paul Benko, and he's also a member of the U.S. Chess Hall of Fame. So very well known player in the chess community. So this was a great game for Bobby Fischer to go out on during the 1966 U.S. Championship. We will go ahead and get into the game. Paul Benko is going to be playing the white pieces. Bobby Fischer, at this time, the 7-time reigning champion, is going to be playing the black pieces. Now, Paul Benko starts out with pawn to G3, and this is the Benko opening. If you're not too familiar with it, this is the opening named after Paul Benko, so he is intimately familiar with this. Little fun fact, again, this is the 1966 U.S. Championship. Only 4 years prior, 1962, at the Candidates Tournament, this opening was actually introduced, and Paul Benko played Bobby Fischer and actually beat him with this opening. So definitely not a very common opening at this time, but Paul Benko probably more familiar with it than anyone. If you know anything about Bobby Fischer, though, he's probably one of the biggest students of the game, loves to study opening and theories and different lines of different openings. If there's one thing that Bobby Fischer let everyone know, is if you beat him with an opening or you kind of outplayed him over the board, he was going to make sure that he studied up and he was more prepared the next time he ever saw that opening or that individual. So you can rest assured, 4 years after Paul Benko kind of introduced this and kind of laid the smackdown on Bobby Fischer, that he was going to be very well prepared when he placed him again, and that's kind of why we're going to be going over this match. So very interesting. Again, Paul Benko plays pawn to G3. Bobby Fischer is going to respond with pawn to G6, kind of mirroring the move from Paul Benko right here. Paul Benko now decides to play bishop to G2. Fianchettoing his bishop to the king side. Kind of a hyper-modern offense, trying to control the center of the board with his modern pieces before he gets his pawns involved into the game. Bobby Fischer now going to play bishop to G7, again fianchettoing his bishop to the king side as well. And now Paul Benko plays pawn to D4. Again, realizing that if Bobby Fischer is not going to try to control the center of the board with his pawns early on, he's going to go ahead and take that initiative himself. Bobby Fischer now plays knight to F6. Again, simple development move, trying to control the center of the board. Paul Benko plays pawn to E4 again. Now that Bobby Fischer has pretty much said he's not going to try to control the center of the board with his pawns early on, Paul Benko is going to, again, continue that initiative, trying to control with his pawns. Bobby Fischer now plays pawn to D6. Very important to note, anytime you have bishops in the early of the game, you never want to block off your bishops behind the pawn chain. You're always going to want to get your bishops out before you kind of connect that pawn chain. But anytime you fianchetto a bishop to one side, most particularly the king side, you actually want to, if you're going to have a pawn structure, then you actually want to put those on the same color. So in this particular case, since the dark square bishop is here on G7, then the pawn structure, if you are going to lock it, you actually want to lock it along those dark squares so that both of your bishops can actually roam freely and develop as they need be. So this light square bishop can get involved into the action if it needs to, and also this dark square bishop is not blocked off as well. So it's just something to think about in your own game. You never want to be blocking off your bishops with your pawns. Paul Benko decides to bring knight to e2. Again, he does want to develop his knight so he can castle on the king side. You always do want king side safety early on into the game, so you can kind of worry about other things as far as development and your game plan. You never want to worry about your opponent attacking your king, especially if your opponent is Bobby Fischer. He doesn't want to bring, let's say, his knight to f3. Again, this pawn right here on e4 is only being protected by this bishop here on g2. So, logical move here, bringing his knight to e2. Still a nice little square, protecting this pawn here on d4, and he can kind of get into the action later on if he needs to pretty easily. From here, Bobby Fischer is going to castle on the king side, and Paul Benko is going to do the same. Bobby Fischer now plays knight to d7. Again, nice little square from him. Is going to be supporting later on if he wants to bring his pawn to c5. He could always bring his pawn to e5. Again, really trying to set up his minor pieces to support pawns early on if he does want to push and kind of counter attack in the center of the board. Always do keep in mind early on your minor pieces support your pawns, your major pieces support your pawns and your minor pieces, but later on to the game, those do kind of take on different roles. Now from here, Paul Benko is going to continue what he's been doing, and that's continue to push his pawns, try to control the center. Right now, he's pretty much completely dominating this 5th rank right here with his pawns. Bobby Fischer is now going to play pawn to e5. Can't just let Paul Benko dominate the center of the board the entire game. So again, this is kind of why he played this pawn, or excuse me, this knight here to d7, so that it would allow him to play this pawn to e5. Now, Paul Benko is going to continue to develop his pieces. He plays knight to c3. Simple development move, trying to control the center of the board. Nice little square for his knight here. It is actually nice that he brought his pawn out first. So pretty much everything's going to be eyeing down on this d5 square right here. There's no piece or pawn there right now, but as you can see, Paul Benko has this pawn, this bishop right here on g2, this queen here on d1, and also this knight here on c3, all kind of looking forward at this square right here, especially if this pawn moves forward to d5. Now, Bobby Fischer on the opposite side does have this knight here on f6, and his next move, he plays pawn to c6. So making sure that he does have some proper defense if Paul Benko decides to move forward. And that's exactly what he does. Tries to push forward a little bit more and try to control that center. Bobby Fischer takes back. And now Paul Benko has a decision. He could, if he wanted to, take with his pawn here on c5. So if you're kind of analyzing this game, trying to figure out what you would do in this situation, he does have a few options. Obviously, he doesn't want to move his queen first because Bobby Fischer has this knight here on f6, but he definitely has this option to bring his pawn here on d5. If you were white playing the situation, later on you'd want to bring your dark square bishop involved into the game. Partly to maybe a g5 square, pinning down this knight here on f6 to this queen here on d8. After that, you would then want to bring your rook over, connect your rooks on the first rank, and then get your rook over to the c file. You always want your rooks on open files. They have a lot more room to roam around. Definitely can support a lot more pieces and move a lot more than they can when they're not on a semi-open or open file. But instead, Paul Benko decides instead to take with his knight on d5. A little more aggressive move. Bobby Fischer obviously is going to recapture. And then from here, Paul Benko again has the option. He can take with his pawn here. But instead, he opts for the more aggressive move, and that is queen takes on d5. Now Bobby Fischer, knowing that this pawn here on d6 does need some protection, instead he's going to bring his knight down here to c5. Nice little outpost move for his knight right here. It is going to take some time before this knight is ever kicked off. And Paul Benko now plays rook over to d1. Again, his major pieces are supporting his other pieces, in this case the queen here on d5. Now Bobby Fischer plays bishop to g4. Now he could have, if he wanted to, just brought his bishop to e6. Bobby Fischer obviously does want to get his light squared bishop involved into the game. It is his last minor piece. After this, he'll obviously want to get his queen involved into the game, and then he can connect his rooks on the 8th rank and kind of get them involved as well. But definitely a great move from him. Obviously, he only has 2 different squares. He could have brought it to e6 and g4. I definitely like the g4 move. It's kind of an in-between move, pinning down this knight here on e2 to the rook here on d1. Kind of a pesky move, and Paul Benko responds with pawn to f3. And this is kind of what Bobby Fischer wanted. Obviously, he's just going to kick back his bishop here to e6. Nice little square for him. But as you can see, anytime you fianchetto your bishop to one side of the board, any other pawns that you move kind of give a little more air and a little more space where your opponent can come in, slip in, and attack this king here. So as you can see, the king side for black is a lot safer than the white side, just because that pawn is moved up from f2 to f3. So it's always those in-between moves. Obviously, Bobby Fischer wants to end up and kick this queen off of d5, but very interesting move, kind of in between, to come in here and bring this pawn up to f3. So from here, Paul Benko plays queen takes on d6. Obviously, he's now supported by his rook here on d1. And Bobby Fischer has a few options. He could, if he wanted to, go ahead and take here on d5, on d6, but instead he plays bishop takes here on c4. So really trying to control the center of the board here with his minor pieces. Paul Benko now decides to bring his knight over to c3. Again, nice central square, wasn't doing a whole lot, was being attacked right here by the bishop on c4. So definitely wants to kind of centralize that knight. So now it's a great square. Later on, if he wants, he has a nice outpost here on d5 he can get to. So nice central development move, second move from this knight, but very, very well placed, where he was kind of misplaced over here on e2. Bobby Fischer now plays queen to a5. Very important move, because he does want to actually kick this queen off of d6. And what he intends to do by bringing his queen over here is now he can slide over one of his rooks. He could bring his rook over from the a file, or he could bring it over from the f file. But as you can see, the queen on a5 is actually protecting this. So he not only has his queen protecting the d8 file, but he also has his other rook protecting this. So as you can see, this Paul Benko is now going to develop his last piece, and he plays bishop to g5. Again, last piece needing development. He has now connected both of his rooks. Both sides have connected both of their rooks, and Paul Benko is thwarting that rook coming over to d8. So not only should you think about in your own games where you should develop your pieces, but you should always think about what your opponent is trying to doing. Most times, players are not just randomly moving their pieces, especially in this situation. His opponent is Bobby Fischer. He didn't just bring his queen over to a5 for no reason at all. So definitely anytime you can develop or move a piece and also thwart your opponent's attacks or plans, definitely a good idea. Now from here, Bobby Fischer is going to bring his knight over to e6. Nice little square, again allowing this queen here on a5 to also protect this pawn here on e5, and it's also attacking the bishop here on g5. Definitely he wants to bring his rook over if he can to d8, as we talked about before. Now this bishop here is thwarting that attack, so a very logical move to bring his knight over to e6 and attack that bishop here on g5. Now from here, Paul Benko is going to play bishop to e7. Obviously his bishop is under attack, so he wants to move that. So very logical move to go ahead and be very, very aggressive. As you can see, Paul Benko is really, really trying to come out strong. Keep in mind in this tournament, this is the very first round of the tournament. So both players want to come out strong. Neither of them want to actually lose the game. If anything, they want to make sure they at least get a tie. The last thing you want to do in a major tournament like this is actually come out with no points at all. If you tie a game, you get half a point. If you win, you get a whole point. So Paul Benko is coming out guns blazing. He wants to go ahead and try to win at least the first round and get off to a good start. So bishop to e7, very aggressive move. Definitely like it. Bobby Fischer responds with rook to e8. Doesn't have a whole lot of moves that he can do, so just kind of counterattacking here with his rook here on e8. Now Paul Benko continues to be aggressive. He plays knight here to d5. Again, this is a nice little outpost move from white here. Bobby Fischer's probably not going to exchange. Most people, especially as this game starts to open up, they typically want to keep their bishop pair. So a lot of times if you're looking at it and you're like, why don't they give up their bishop for their knight? That's why. Top players typically, especially in an open game, want to keep that bishop pair there. Now Bobby Fischer, as he usually does, he kind of counterattacks and he plays bishop to e2 here, attacking this rook here on d1. And Paul Benko just slides it over to c1. Obviously he was trying to control and support this long d file, but now he is on this long c file. Still a very, very powerful square for him to support and take control of. Now at this situation, Paul Benko realized that he doesn't really have any other attacks. Obviously his bishop really can't do anything. His queen is being supported. He's supporting this bishop here on e7, but he decides kind of to fall back. There's not really anything he can do, so he brings back, after Bobby Fischer brings his knight over to d4, nice little outpost move for him. Paul Benko just brings his queen back here to b4. Really just asking Bobby Fischer if he wants to go ahead and exchange major pieces and kind of move towards the end game. Bobby Fischer accepts. He brings his queen, takes on b4, and then Paul Benko recaptures here on b4. Now the next move is probably one of the biggest turning points in the game. Now Bobby Fischer, if you kind of look at both sides, it's fairly equal. Both sides are equal in material. Both sides had a very, very similar middle of the game. They do have a knight here on d4 and on d5, both very nice outposts for each of those pieces. Both sides do have a bishop that's kind of very involved into the game, and they both have a bishop that's not doing a whole lot. Both of their fianchetto bishops are kind of blocked off by their own pawns right now. And then both sides do have both of their rooks both on the 1st and the 8th rank. So this is a pretty equal position right here. And as Bobby Fischer typically does, he kind of mixes it up. Now, in this situation, a lot of different grandmasters and international masters and people have analyzed this game and even run it through powerful chess engines. Think that his next move was maybe not a mistake, but definitely could have gone and played a much safer and better move. Definitely opened up Pandora's box and allowed his opponent, Paul Benko, to actually take a large advantage. So the next move from Bobby Fischer is knight takes on f3. Again, attacking the king here on g1. Now this is being supported by this bishop on e2, so if you're kind of wondering why Paul Benko doesn't just go ahead and take, again, as we talked about before, players really don't want to trade off and get rid of that bishop pair. So Paul Benko instead plays king to f2, and now interesting move of the game is Bobby Fischer, after he brings his knight to d4, again, nice little central square, Paul Benko plays knight to c7. Now he's attacking and forking both of these rooks right here. But instead of moving one of them and kind of starting a counterattack from that way, Bobby Fischer instead plays bishop to h6. Now in this situation, Paul Benko should go ahead and take one of these rooks. It's going to be very, very advantageous. He's going to have a huge advantage if he can take one of these. But instead, you can kind of see with his next move that he pretty much throws it away. Bobby Fischer in this situation with his counterattack, I think Bobby Fischer realized that his knight to f3 was a little bit ambitious, wasn't really going to be doing a whole lot. And so he kind of is playing mind games. If you kind of look at this from Paul Benko, he came here to c7, attacking both of these rooks, and Bobby Fischer, the 7-time champion, comes here to h6 as though he doesn't even see it. So it kind of feels like Paul Benko is unsure of himself. Bobby Fischer's pretty much wrapped up, a nice little present on Christmas Day, and I guess Paul Benko got that, and not a big Christmas fan, but decided to not unwrap that, thought it was a trap, and actually gave it back to Bobby Fischer in the form of a terrible move. So instead he plays rook over to e1, kind of what he should have done. He could have easily played, knight takes on e8, and, one of two moves. Let's say the bishop came down and captured here on c1. Then the knight can come back to c7, attacking this rook here on a8. If the bishop came to b2, the rook here can come to b1. Again, both the bishop here on b2 and the rook here on a8 are both being attacked. Definitely going to be a much better game for Paul Benko here. But even if Bobby Fischer didn't come down here, if he were to take the knight here on e8 and just kind of said, you know what, I made a mistake, I'll go ahead and take this back right here. Paul Benko could bring his rook over to c7. This is a fantastic move. Anytime you can get your rook on your opponent's 7th or 2nd rank, depending on if you're white or black, that's going to be very, very hard for your opponent to deal with. Typically, you're going to have pawns on that 2nd or 7th ranked, and so you can pretty much just gobble up a lot of pawns. So this would be a huge, huge advantage for Paul Benko. But you can kind of see that the pressure of playing Bobby Fischer got to him. You can also see that he didn't want to make a huge mistake. Again, this is round 1. The last thing you want to do is come out of round 1 with 0 points. So he played a move that ended up costing him the game. Bobby Fischer, after this move, actually now has the advantage. Something you never want to do is give Bobby Fischer an advantage. But again, he plays rook over to e1. And now Bobby Fischer plays his rook over to c8. Now, it's a much different story because after Paul Benko plays knight over and takes on a8, now Bobby Fischer can bring his rook down to c2. Now, one thing that Bobby Fischer does better than almost anyone in the history of chess is he really is able to bring all of his pieces together and have them work really, really well together. So, as you can see this, the knight over here on a8 is not doing a whole lot, although it did just capture a piece, a major piece from black. But again, as I've always talked about in my videos, it's not how many pieces you have on the board, it's about how many pieces you have in the battle attacking your opponent's king. So in this situation, Bobby Fischer actually has that advantage. So if you kind of look at this before, where Paul Benko could have had his rook over here on c7, really putting a lot of pressure on Bobby Fischer. As you can see right now, all the pressure is starting to mount on Paul Benko from black. So from here, Paul Benko is just going to take this bishop here on e2, and Bobby Fischer is going to take with his rook here on e2. Paul Benko now plays king to f1. He doesn't have a whole lot of options as far as where his king can run to. But from here, Bobby Fischer just, again, as we talked about with the rook on the 2nd or 7th rank, he can just kind of gobble up those pieces as he sees fit. So he comes over, starts to gobble up some of that material back over to b2. Paul Benko decides to bring his bishop to c3. He knows that he's either going to take this rook here on b2, or as we talked about, this very, very nicely placed knight here on d4. He could also take that as well. So from here, Bobby Fischer plays rook to c2, and Paul Benko decides to capture this knight here on d4. So just to show you the power of the outpost, again, as we talked about before, this has now become an open game. The bishop pair for white is very, very important, but because this outpost from knight of black's knight was so great, not only did Paul Benko see it fit to trade off his bishop for that, but he also gave Bobby Fischer a pass pawn here on d4. Just as a side note, obviously you can't play Bobby Fischer because he's dead, but I typically don't recommend giving Bobby Fischer a pass pawn. Just things typically go horribly wrong. But side note, from here, Paul Benko plays pawn to e5, opening up the door so his light square bishop can control this long diagonal here. Also, if he wants to later on, he could develop a pass pawn on the king side of Bobby Fischer. Now, Bobby Fischer brings his bishop down to e3. Bobby Fischer does a great job of anytime there's an outpost for any of his minor pieces, as we saw before with the knight here on d4, he now brings his bishop to e3. Great outpost for his bishop. Obviously, this pawn is protected on d4, and this bishop here on e3. It's pretty much going to mitigate a lot of the moves that the king can move, and it's also pretty much just going to just shut down anything that white wants to do in this general vicinity. White now decides to bring his bishop over to b7, trying to get some of that material back. From here, again, white is up in material, not for too long. Bobby Fischer now brings his rook over to f1. White doesn't have a whole lot of options. He brings his king over to e1. And now Bobby Fischer plays pawn to d3. Anytime you have a passed pawn, rule number 1 in chess, push the passed pawn. Pretty simple concept. That's why you see it here with Bobby Fischer. Now white knows that he needs to stop that passed pawn. That passed pawn can easily turn into a queen without a whole lot of thought from Bobby Fischer. So even if white has to give back material, he needs to make sure he stops that pawn. So that's exactly what he does. He plays bishop to a6 right here. As you can kind of see, this bishop right here is about to be traded off. This knight right here on a8 is not doing a whole heck of a lot, and this rook here on a1 has yet to move into the game. And the king from e1 is kind of out in the middle of the board. So although Bobby Fischer doesn't have as much material, he does have a lot more attacking, where this king right here on g8 is just kind of hanging out and chilling. So from here, Bobby Fischer plays rook to e2, and now Paul Benko pretty much makes his last big mistake of the game. Instead of kind of moving away from all the attacking that Bobby Fischer has, he instead plays d1. Now, he probably should have played f1. We'll kind of talk about that here in a second. But after he plays d1, then Bobby Fischer is just going to come over here to h2, take this material, and Paul Benko, as he has to, he's going to go ahead and take this pass pawn here on d3, but now Bobby Fischer can come in to d2, and he's not only attacking this king here on d1 with check, but he's also attacking the bishop here on d3. Now, this would not have happened if the king came over to f1, but again, another huge mistake by Paul Benko. So Bobby Fischer gobbles up this material. After the king comes over to e1, Paul Benko tries to push a little forward. All Bobby Fischer has to do is bring his rook over to a3. Nice little safe square protecting this bishop here on e3. And now white has to get his knight involved into the game. Obviously, he is down in material now, so he needs to make something happen, and a knight on a8 definitely is not doing a whole lot of good. Bobby Fischer from here can pretty much smell the victory, so as he always does, he plays a fantastic endgame. He brings his bishop to a d4, not only attacking this pawn here on e5, but also attacking the rook here on a1. Anytime you're up in material, you definitely want to be trading down. The more you can trade down, the more it magnifies your actual advantage that you have. So from here, Paul Benko plays knight to b5. He doesn't have a whole lot of options. He is attacking this rook here on a3, but Bobby Fischer doesn't care because he's going to get a 2-for-1. He's going to come down, take this rook here on a1, but after the knight takes on a3, he's going to come back and gobble up this pawn here on e5. So Bobby Fischer is now up 2 pawns in material, and he also has the better minor piece. Now, what I mean by that is anytime you have pawns on 2 sides of the board, you actually would prefer to have a bishop. Why is that? Because there's 2 sides of the board you need to attack and defend. Bishops can get around the map much quicker than a knight. So bishops tend to do well when there's pawns on both sides of the board, and knights actually pretend to do a little bit better when there's pawns on only one side of the board. They can pretty much control a lot of the different moving squares and moving pieces on one side of the board. So if they don't have to move around a lot, they actually outperform bishops on one side of the board. So if you're ever trying to figure out what you should trade down to or what position is better, kind of think of that. How many sides of the board are there? In this situation, there are 2 sides. Obviously, pawns on the queen side and pawns on the king side. And Bobby Fischer, what do you know, has the better minor piece right here. So from here, the pawn's going to come up to g4. Again, it's being attacked by this bishop here on e5. And then Bobby Fischer plays king to g7. Now, anytime you kind of approach the end game, anytime major pieces, the queens and rooks start to come off the board, your king no longer wants to be safe. He no longer wants to be in a corner, hiding. Instead, he becomes a valuable asset. The first thing you want to do is centralize your king. You can really, really have a strong attack with your king supporting all your major and minor pieces. So in this case, Bobby Fischer is going to get to the center of the board as fast as he can. Paul Benko plays knight to c4, and Bobby Fischer just plays king to f6. Even though he does have the better minor piece, if Paul Benko were to come here and take here on e5, he's going to have not only the better central king, but he also is up 2 pawns in material. It's going to be way too difficult for Paul Benko to come back. And actually on this move right here, Paul Benko gave up. Now, one thing I always like to do when I analyze a chess game is kind of go back and think about what I learned during the game. If you just watch a game and you don't really learn anything from it, I feel like there's kind of a disconnect as far as improving as a chess player. So kind of something I took away from this is to trust your instinct. I think one of the biggest mistakes in this game is actually when Bobby Fischer played, his bishop over to h6. As we kind of go back in the game, instead of, we'll go back 2 moves here, once he played his bishop here to h6, Paul Benko had a great attack. All he had to do was take one of these rooks here on e8 or a8, but instead, the stage he was on, the first round, he definitely didn't want a mistake. Wasn't quite sure if he was falling into a trap. Wasn't quite sure what Bobby Fischer was doing. He was kind of leaving the door open for a big attack from Paul Benko. So instead of trusting his instincts, he made a big mistake. And he started to play a little bit passive. And the huge advantage that he did have, he kind of gave that back to Bobby Fischer because he wasn't really sure what was going on. So definitely in your own game when you're playing, if you have a strong attack, go with your gut, go with your instinct, follow through with that. Your opponent's going to be throwing anything they can at you. So let them do that and just continue what you're doing and win the game. So hopefully you guys enjoy this video. Again, this is the third part of the upcoming graphic novel Bobby Fischer, The Knight Who Killed the Kings. If you want more information, there's a great website below that has all the information you would want to know about the upcoming graphic novel. Again, if you have not already subscribed to the YouTube channel, so you know when upcoming videos have just come out, definitely feel free to subscribe. If you have a comment about the video, or if you want to just ask me something, feel free to leave a comment below. And also, if you wouldn't mind favoring the video, like it, the thumbs up, whatever you do below in the video. Definitely appreciate it. Hopefully you guys enjoy the video and you learned something. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.